A very, very warm welcome to everybody who's joining us for the launch of Beyond the Blueprint today. Let me introduce our author of Beyond the Blueprint, Kalnisha Singh. She is the founder of KD Strategies, and for over 2 decades, she has been working in the development sector as a development economist. She's often the person that gets called in when a project is flailing or failing and has been able to turn those around. And she'll be sharing more about that today. I can't always keep up with all the awards that Kalnisha and Katie Strategies are raking in, but the most recent has been the Solar Quarter Women in Energy Award. And alongside that, many accolades for Katie Strategies as well. Kalnisha, welcome to you. You've titled the series Beyond the Blueprint, and you have a very specific reason for that. What does it mean to you, and why do you feel that this is the right time to release it?
Hi, everyone. And thanks, Marie, for hosting these sessions. I see a lot of familiar names in the participant list, and I think that anybody who knows me or has worked with KD Strategies or We Connect or any one of the organizations in our umbrella knows that we have for years been talking about the extreme frustration we're feeling with history seeming to repeat itself in the development ecosystem, at least. And when we talk about development, I think it's important for me to clarify that we work specifically in economic development, so anything that enables sort of economic progress, industrial development, and have done so for the last 22 years, which means that we work in the construction sector, we work in the transportation sector, we work in any kind of expansionary projects, infrastructure development, mining, financial services, in sort of industrial sectors that enable economic progress, right? Or intend to enable economic progress, particularly in South Africa and on the African continent. And the extreme frustration that we feel or have felt recently, and I'd say recently being the sort of last 7 to 10 years, is that even though there are new industrial models being introduced into the economy, in the implementation or execution of those models, we see the same mistakes being made over and over and over again. And a lot of those mistakes result from systemic factors or systematic factors, but a lot of those mistakes are also avoidable. And we just don't seem to, collectively, we don't seem to be learning our lesson, which is a source of intense frustration. And I think that also, the 20-year mark for KD Strategies was sort of a turning point as well, where we really took pause to reflect on everything that we've done over the last 2 decades and reflect properly on our successes and our failures and the lessons that we have learned as an organization in our work. And I think anyone that works in development, whether again that development looks like, the building of a manufacturing facility or a renewable energy project, or that development means community development or social development on the ground at grassroots level, I think the extreme frustration that everybody that's working to build anything feels is that it does sometimes feel like you're on a hamster wheel and that there's very little progress happening. And even though the building might be built, there were lots of challenges along the way, lots of wastage, lots of inefficiency, and similarly, if you're building a sort of NGO at the grassroots level, I think everybody's feeling that stickiness, that frustration, that sort of rolling off the hamster wheel, where the lack of progress is almost tangible. So, like I said, the 20-year mark for us was really an opportunity to take stock and understand and try and unpack what those frustrations and sticky points are in our work, but also generally for those of us that are working in these fields. And a big realization for me is that because we work firmly as consulting practitioners, firmly for the private sector most of the time, a lot of our storytelling focuses largely on the successes and the positive outcomes. We don't tell enough stories about what those sticky points are, what the challenges are, what the failures are. Obviously, it's not great marketing to talk about what's gone wrong. And at the same time, because of that, a lot of the key lessons, the important lessons, have not been shared amongst us, ourselves as peer groups, amongst competing entities because it is a competitive environment. And as such, collectively, we aren't able to learn from each other's lessons and case studies and mistakes. And we just thought, and I just thought personally, so it was a personal decision on my part that I really do believe that we are able to make significantly different decisions going forward. I want my children, not just my grandchildren now, to realize a better life and a better future in this country and on this continent. And for that, in order to enable that, I've made the decision, we collectively as an organization have made the decision to start openly sharing about the things we're seeing and the failures that we experience and the lessons that we have learned. And I think for me, that's the key messaging around Beyond the Blueprint. And the reason we decided on Beyond the Blueprint as a title for the series is because, again, I've been speaking a lot about how the economic development models that we've been trained to utilize in our consulting practice are not models that are designed for the local context in South Africa, on the African continent, and in the global south in general. I mean, as practitioners, as business owners in the private sector, we still sort of lean on European models, American models as best practice, without necessarily contextualizing those best practice models for our local context. And that's why I believe that we need to look beyond maybe those benchmarks, beyond those blueprints, in order to achieve the sort of successes that we are hoping to achieve in the short term, in the medium term, and for the future that we want to see.
And I'm sure that frustration is something that people who are here today and people who are looking at this blueprint are looking to resolve. So many of us can easily slip into just turning the frustration and the complaining into more of a national sport. And you've gone to do something very useful with it, channeling it into this and also sharing it. And as you say, been so public. So that frustration with the repeating old mistakes is at the heart of all this. Where are some examples of where sticking to the blueprint has really just failed us?
So the example I've been using recently is always so there's two examples, and I think again the people that are in the audience that have had recent conversations with me have heard this before, so I apologize in advance. We talk about, for example, creating inclusionary environments and women empowerment and gender dynamics and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those sorts of narratives, right? And there's lots of activity around Women's Month and things like that. And Katie Strategies ourselves, we host a platform called We're Connected for Women in the Energy Sector. So there's lots of hype and discussion around inclusion from that perspective. Um, but structurally, what spaces are still not designed for the inclusion of women, as an example. And we know that from an economic perspective, because if you're in a public space, say you go to the movies and you need to go to the bathroom, there's always a queue outside the women's toilet. Always, unequivocally, all the time, always a queue outside the women's toilet in a public space. If the space was designed to include women, that would not be the case. If we applied economic development principles to the design of spaces, the spaces would accommodate for the demand of women. And that's a very, very basic example where the blueprints don't work. Similarly, if we think about public participation processes that are designed and mandated in our national regulations around environmental management, occupational health and safety, and various other construction regulations, a very, very prescriptive public participation narrative that's included in the regulation. That public participation framework was designed in Europe, right? It doesn't necessarily consider local dynamics, availability of local public spaces, local languages, the media processes locally, the publication processes locally. And again, that's another segment or sector where the blueprint, the current prevailing blueprints, completely and intrinsically fail in the local context. And we can take the same sort of, if we take that same perspective, we can look at lots of different categories of work and efforts where the frameworks within which we work have just not been designed for us, right? And it's really just a call for us now to look beyond those frameworks, to identify the root causes of what's not working and why it's not working, and start shifting if we want to see real tangible progress, and not have the same frustrations replay themselves over and over again.
That is a bunch of powerful insights. There's always that element of ignoring the global south, right? And we have this inferiority complex collectively, and seeing the successes and building on that is the best way to go and redress that problem. But Kalnisha, you've decided to make the first in this series about infrastructure, and specifically with a focus on energy infrastructure. Yet there are universal lessons. Why did you choose infrastructure as your entry point?
It wasn't necessarily intentional, and I'll be absolutely honest about that. So the process that we followed internally was to go back and review as many of our past projects as possible. So understanding that we've been working for the last 22 years, March will be 23 years. It was a lot of paperwork and sort of digital records and stuff to sort of start trawling through. And because a large focus of our work and our activity and engagement over the last sort of since about 2014 has been around the energy ecosystem. It was the easiest to start reviewing. The information was fresh, it was right then available. But also, once we started going through our project databases and reviewing our project postmortems and remembering a lot of what happened during these project implementations, I was taken back to the very beginning. So KD Strategy started in 2003 in the infrastructure space. So some of our very first projects were around port expansions, new airports, the stadiums, and things like that, right? So we started in infrastructure. So it was a really nice sort of broad look at everything that's happened over the last 22 years. And again, I suppose it highlighted again the frustration because the mistakes that were made 22 years ago were the same mistakes being made again in the more recent projects. So it's been 2 decades, more than 2 decades of similar activity, but we're failing to learn the lessons.
And this is a really relevant place to start learning the lessons because energy
Exactly.
is such a vital topic to all of us now.
We all know that energy infrastructure is an expansionary process. There's lots of things happening. We hear a lot about the just energy transition and the changes in regulations and announcements being made by the ministry and the relevant departments almost on a monthly basis about changes and tweaks and improvements and to enable the sort of ease of activity around the energy landscape. At the same time, we all know that our president committed R1 trillion worth of investment over the next 3 years in the energy landscape. There's lots of foreign investment being channeled into the sector. I thought it was sort of crucial. It's important for us to learn those lessons before all of that is activated so that we can enable better, more successful outcomes, right?
Excellent. Yes. And energy is the tip of the iceberg because those answers echo throughout the other industries. And I think we'll be seeing them in the follow-on pieces. But it's great to see a lot of people here today who are actually from the energy and especially the renewable energy sector. That is wonderful because this is specifically relevant to them. Let's go and unpack some of those lessons. Kalnisha, just as an overview from your experience, what are the three most critical lessons you think everybody in a complex project should understand?
There are three key insights that are elevated in the first Beyond the Blueprint document. Subtle realities that are not always sort of elevated in the design of projects, in the discussion of projects, realities that have the most negative impact if not adequately addressed, right? The first one is, and I think everybody again who knows me expects this one, is the sort of consistent lack of engagement or understanding of community dynamics. So, and by that I specifically mean the local communities around which these projects are being developed. So we all understand that our communities in South Africa and on the continent largely are impoverished, are underemployed, lack access to resources, right? And that's typically the framing in our own minds that we walk into these communities with. What we don't acknowledge is that these communities are a wealth of information and knowledge, and perhaps not, professional skills, but definitely skills. And those elements are consistently undervalued. And I'll give a very, very unusual example. So, in South Africa right now, particularly around the areas that have been earmarked for significant energy development, those communities are facing direct impacts of climate change, changing weather patterns. And the weather patterns in South Africa, I mean, all of us that are in the cities understand this, but I think everybody that lives outside of a city understands it even better, just because of the connection with nature. But our weather patterns are shifting every 3 to 4 years. Rainy seasons are changing. The quantum of rain that's being experienced is changing. That information is not documented anywhere. Right. The weather's changing faster than the researchers are able to document it. So, what that means is if you're planning a construction project, if you don't have any local insights around what the weather has done for the last 12 to 24 months, your construction plan already has a point of failure in it because you're not necessarily understanding when is the rainy season, what happens during the rainy season, is the stormwater infrastructure sufficient enough to collect the additional rain? Is the ground condition the same? Because if you are building in an area that has consistently heavy rainfall, unusually and unexpected heavy rainfall for a number of seasons, then the topsoil has been eroded, which means your ground conditions are different than what you expected in your geotechnical reports, right? You will not get those insights unless you commission those reports again, or unless you engage effectively with the local community to understand what's going on, right? A key point of failure, and again, it's not failure, like your project is not going to not be built because you don't understand the community dynamics. But your project execution is likely to be less efficient than what it could be if you don't understand the community dynamics. Another point on the community aspects is that understanding that every key stakeholder goes in with fundamentally different intentions and priorities. So for the developer, for the stakeholder that's actually in the private sector building this infrastructure or building the project at whatever level, the priority is obviously a certain thing to ensure compliance, ensure the contracts are complied with and achieved, that the regulations are complied with, that the risk is mitigated, that the profits are achieved. Your municipal or public sector stakeholders have a completely different set of intentions and priorities, right? Your municipal officials probably want to ensure that they're re-elected. The municipal administrators probably want to ensure that their jobs are safe. And then there's a myriad of other things that are also at play. Community members typically just want to see progress, and for them, progress means investment in social projects, employment, if at all possible, but also just communication. And real and relevant communication. Most people want to feel like they're part of something. And when you come into stakeholder meetings, because of the different power dynamics at play, the intentionality or the priorities are not adequately, I believe, articulated or transparent. We see that there's a lot of miscommunication and the creation of unrealistic expectations. And when the private sector actor, the developer, the investor, the whomever, is not clear and transparent about their intentions in community engagement, that opens the door for extortionary behavior, for protest action, for community dissatisfaction, for all of the negative things that we feel around these projects.
The fact that community engagement is not really quantifiable puts it at risk of becoming the checkbox exercise. And because it seems like a checkbox exercise, that incredible resource is often not tapped.
Often not tapped, but also from a private sector perspective, from a project perspective, that sort of role in the organization is typically under resourced. So, in order
Mm,
for there to be effective community engagement, you need somebody that understands social performance. You need an excellent communicator, right? You need somebody that understands intelligence, security intelligence networks, and how to access information. You need somebody that understands political dynamics in the political landscape, right? Those are very, very unlikely to be all the same person. So typically we see that these teams are completely under-resourced. I mean, and that's just the first insight. The second insight in this sort of infrastructure ecosystem is that the pace of change around regulations, compliance, and benchmarking is exponential. It is
mm,
absolutely exponential. If we think about just the health and safety regulations, so we look at legislation, regulations, and international standards. So international standards are important because international standards are typically what the funders of these projects align to. And you
mm,
need to apply international standards in the projects in order to meet your financing contractual obligations, which is of critical importance in these projects, right? Without the money, there's nothing. The pace of change is huge. So a lot of the local commercial banks, for example, have aligned to IFC standards. IFC is the International Finance Corporation. The IFC executive and board can decide on a quarterly basis how to change those standards. And usually in these contracts, it refers to adhering to the standards as applied at any point in time. So it's really important to keep abreast of all of those things. And given the myriad of regulations, legislation, and standards that most of these projects have to comply with, what you find typically is that there's lots of inefficiencies baked in. And I'll give you an example again. Something as simple as sort of managing site-based grievances, it's a one-liner. Site-based grievances have to be managed. Makes sense. There are 5 different regulatory frameworks in an infrastructure project that mandate grievance processes, and it's 5 different grievance processes that are mandated. And then if you count the international standards, there's 3 or 4 different international standards that also mandate grievance processes in different sort of segments of the organization or project. And what we find when we go into audit these projects is that you have 8 different grievance processes run by 8 different departments on one single site. And what inevitably happens is that you have beautifully documented grievances and processes, but very few resolved grievances. Um,
mm,
because everybody is just referring to everybody else and you haven't followed my process, and it's just a whole bunch of inefficiency. And like you mentioned, earlier, we're typically called in when a project finds itself in all of these chaotic problems. So with the grievances, what happens is if a funder, for example, that is applying IFC standards comes to audit a project and these certain compliances are not adhered to, they call for a stop work order and then the project stops until these things are resolved, right? And on these sometimes billion-rand projects, every day of stoppage costs enormous amounts of money. And then also starting work again isn't we push the button and everything starts. It's a phase
mm,
startup always. So you have direct time lost and indirect time lost, and it's a hugely enormous, expensive exercise. Also, if you're calling somebody in retrospectively to come help you fix the problems, that's a hugely expensive exercise
mm.
because you're paying premium consulting rates because it's urgent. We need to bring in a whole team of people instead of, 1 or 2 people because now it's an urgent problem that needs to be resolved with a significant time pressure.
If this is predictable and there are ways to prepare for this with foresight instead of hindsight, not only does it mean projects move forward, but it means the budget that is allocated can do so much more rather than go over budget or scramble to get more funds.
100%. And I mean, in that whole scenario I just described is just about grievance processes. Across the myriad of regulations, legislation, and standards that these projects have to adhere to, there are, I was going to say hundreds, it's not quite hundreds, but it's definitely tens of examples of embedded inefficiency if it's not dealt with upfront in the planning processes.
And yet, once again, avoidable problems.
Completely avoidable.
Very, very insightful. So, our second insight there is about the regulatory frameworks and really being sure that regulatory compliance does require integrated planning. The third insight, Kalnisha?
The third insight is my favorite. It's also the most obvious. It's people dynamics, inter-organizational people dynamics, right? So again, for context, what we see with these very, very large sort of multi-stakeholder projects is you have interesting contracting. So you'll have multiple, project shareholders or project investors. You have you have multiple stakeholders within a sort of development landscape. You have multiple asset managers because these projects are vast, they require a lot of capital. You have lots of, really important people thrown in together to work together quite quickly to achieve these outcomes. These interrelational dynamics are fascinating to watch play out because you have teams that have never worked together being forced to work together, individuals that have never worked together being forced to work together. If it's a project that requires construction, you have joint venture vehicles, you have international organizations having to work with local organizations, you have the dynamics around local procurement and engaging local suppliers. So you have these wide range of people dynamics. And typically, I mean, I think everybody in the room understands that if it's a renewable energy project or any infrastructure project, by the time the project achieves what we call financial close, so it's ready to build, the project is already under enormous time pressure, right? You have 18 to 24 months to build a renewable energy project once all the paperwork is signed. It's not a lot of time to get to know each other and understand how each other works and do all of those beautiful organizational dynamic stuff that we do at big corporates, emotional intelligence and team building and all of those great things to get us working together nicely. And because we don't get the time to do those things, what happens on these projects is a lot of unintentional internal, what we call sabotage. I don't answer your emails because I don't like how you speak to me. Um, I don't send you that piece of information because, and it's just human dynamics. Or people haven't worked together before, so they don't understand each other's negotiation style. And what that does is it delays contracting, right? And puts the, the project under even further time pressure. You have people coming in from different, especially now in the renewable energy sector, right? There's such a skills shortage. So there's teams that come together to build these projects or execute these projects are highly skilled, highly professional, highly competent individuals, right? Typically, very, very well equipped to do this work, but they don't necessarily understand how each other works. Everybody brings their own unique genius to the table, and it's sometimes and then become demotivated because their genius is not recognized by the other person. These interorganizational dynamics, single point of failure for the biggest projects and the obviously the simplest to resolve. You know, let's unpack our terms of engagement before we start working together. Let's bring in the human capital, talent management resources needed in order to facilitate these conversations. Let's not pretend that we understand how to negotiate with each other. Let's call in, an a mediator to help us through these negotiations. Those are the simplest things. What we also see, because there's so much money at play and money makes, the world crazy, is that the most interesting things are being used as leverage in contract negotiations. So, I'll hold off signing this because I want to achieve that. And it literally puts the whole project at risk because of this interesting strategy that you are now employing in these projects. I could carry on forever, but I'm going to pause.
This is really fascinating stuff. Very, very simple things, as you say, and yet they are not done. And human relationships are tricky at the best of times, right? So put that in a high stakes environment, the implications are massive. So now we've had our three insights that are specifically from energy infrastructure, but I think those people in the room who are not from the energy sector are already recognizing some patterns that they've seen in the projects that they've tackled. How do these insights apply beyond the sector? And how do you think people can take this into whatever field they're working in?
The conversation around the human interpersonal dynamics within the organization is so relevant everywhere we go, in every instance. And just to be blunt, right, I think that as humans, particularly humans in a working environment, we are trained in terms of how to present ourselves, what is politically correct, how to play the politics, how to speak in a certain way, how to negotiate in a certain way, how to work within, the culture of the organization, all these sorts of things. And what it's led to is that every time we walk into a boardroom, particularly at a senior position, you walk in with all of these masks on. What we're seeing now is that that doesn't serve anybody. You have to, especially in these high pressure, extremely intense environments, you have to be able to engage authentically in order to progress effectively. There's no time, there's no time for bureaucracy and, forgive me, but bullshit. There is no time. We have to engage authentically. And I think that if that is the single learning that everybody gets from our lessons, it's that engage authentically and then encourage everybody else, and that it will encourage everybody else around you to also engage authentically. If I don't agree with you on this point of negotiation, it's better for all of us if I just say that I don't agree with you instead of, throwing throwing you with other stuff and trying to play chess with this point of negotiation. At the same time, in the organizations, and I think it's a conversation that's been had in the organizational design space for a long time, is that because of bureaucratic structures, we've become so accustomed to working in silos. And again, in these highly complex, high risk, high stakes projects, we cannot afford to build those walls around ourselves. We have to work collaboratively with each other, collaboratively and authentically, right, in order to progress at the pace with the efficiency that we need to progress. That's the one thing. The other thing is around the community dynamics. And it relates directly back to the authenticity of us being as human beings. A lot of the time we see that investors, project developers, politicians, public sector officials walk into communities automatically placing themselves on a pedestal above everybody else, with the assumption being that because communities living in poverty are underemployed, maybe undereducated, that they are ignorant or they don't understand what's going on, or the assumptions are made that the community has nothing to offer me. And that is fundamentally the wrong assumption, especially in these contexts, right? The community has a lot to offer. And we just need to know, I suppose, need to humble ourselves to a certain extent to engage effectively in order to gather those insights. I think that around the regulatory dynamics, international standards, I think that a lot of us and I think you said it earlier, a lot of us in the global south, in sort of emerging economies, in South Africa on the continent, we assume that we are incapable, ignorant, unaware, and stuff. So when new regulations are passed, when new standards are introduced, we act from a space of fear and panic rather than, confidence, which is, I mean, it's a great opportunity for consultants to make lots of money, but it doesn't serve anyone or any of the project or our future in any kind of way. I think that a great example for me is it's a new old conversation around ESG and sustainability. My favorite example is that most ESG frameworks in the world look exactly like South Africa's BEE scorecard, right? The words might be different, the vocabulary might be different, but the impact that we are measuring is the same, right? So as a South African business, if you're now having to comply with ESG, but you've been complying with BEE, successfully passing your audits every year for the last 10 years, you really shouldn't worry. You maybe need a dictionary,
Wait, wait.
somebody to help you interpret the vocabulary, but you're probably doing all the right things already. So we can't. We have to look at the regulatory ecosystems and the international standards from a position of confidence rather than a position of fear. And I think just that reframing in our own minds will change the dynamics for us collectively.
We definitely deserve to walk a bit taller. And it almost seems that when we do, a lot of the other things are going to fall in place. And a lot of that is that being humble enough to run the personal relationships in a way that serve the project as well. Great insights, Kalnisha. And I think that is evidence of how far this has applicability and relevance, not only beyond the blueprint, but beyond the infrastructure sector and energy, but really into everything that we do. But there's a little tail end to this, Kalnisha, and that is that you have a personal stake in Beyond the Blueprint. It's a very much a part of your professional and your personal growth. And you've called it a reckoning, which is a very strong word that gives me goosebumps. How has your own journey shaped this thinking?
I'm always so nervous of personal questions. Um, I think again that anybody that knows me knows that I got into this line of work. I was very young when Katie Strategy started, and it started almost accidentally. I was very young and very idealistic. I think I'm still very, very idealistic. There are so many opportunities, and there have always been so many opportunities. And our regulatory environment, even though it is onerous, and even though, our implementation skills leave a lot to be desired, our regulatory environment ecosystem is beautiful if you consider what its intention is around how we progress, how we achieve, how we grow from an economic perspective, but also from a socio-economic perspective as a collective, as a country. We really should be holding space as role models for the rest of the global south, just based on that ecosystem. And when I started this work, I started with the confidence and arrogance, I think, of youth and education, being the first person in my family to have an education. And I was convinced, completely convinced by, the research work and the methods and the methodologies and the frameworks that were published out of Harvard Business School and Oxford and all of these big fancy names. And that fueled my confidence. And not very long after I started work, I realized how ineffective those models and benchmarks and research methods and all of those things were because we were just not seeing the success in the work as outcomes of the work. And of course, the beautiful marketing, brochures in those days got published because there were aspects to celebrate. But if you looked at what was celebrated versus what we intended to achieve through those projects, they were very, very, very divergent. And we keep seeing that over and over again. Beautiful intentions is described in the legislation, in the regulation, even in the contracts. But what is actually achieved when compared with those intentions is very, very divergent. At first, as a business, we kind of blamed ourselves like, what are we doing wrong? You know, are we doing anything wrong? Because all the clients are happy. So, how wrong can it be? But the reckoning was actually, it's not enough that the clients are happy or the clients are satisfied. It's not
Mm,
enough that we can explain away why the impact that we intended wasn't achieved. That's not enough. It's not enough for me. It's definitely not enough for us as an economy to call ourselves or to confidently call ourselves emerging with being emerged at some point as the intention. And that was the
mm,
reckoning for me. And then the realization that we have to change how we do things if we are going to achieve those beautiful idealistic outcomes, which are entirely possible, right?
mm,
And how I justify that it's entirely possible is like if we look at the quantum of money that is spent in development, under the guise of development, and in our context means socioeconomic development, the amount of money that's spent in education by the public sector, the amount of money that's spent in education or developing the education ecosystem by the private sector, we should have fundamentally different outcomes, in education, but we're not. And that's the reality. So, what are we doing to enable that disconnect? And then what are we doing to solve for that disconnect? And that was kind of our reckoning. And then just on Beyond the Blueprint. So, I keep talking about the series, and it is a series. So, our lessons learned from the energy landscape is the first publication now. The second one will be the lessons that we have learned in, this is a tough commitment to make out loud, but the lessons that we've learned in the sort of broader transformation landscape. So implementing transformation, BEE, sustainability projects across different industries, from mining to manufacturing and transport and all the different industries, the lessons that we have learned and the mistakes that corporates, private sector entities, and even public sector entities keep making around transformation, copying and pasting strategies that don't work. We're going to be talking about that in the next iteration. We're going to be talking about specifically the mining ecosystem. So, successes and failures that we've seen around mine maintenance processes, closure, rehabilitation, transition, transaction, so sale and acquisition, and that kind of environment. We're going to be talking about localization, which again I think is important for the energy landscape, but equally important for transport and manufacturing and the automotive sector. We've worked in all of those areas over the last couple of decades, and we're going to be sharing our dirty laundry about that. Then, specifically, what works and what doesn't work around community engagement, unpacking different communities across Southern Africa, and what works and what doesn't work in certain situations. And lastly, the last iteration of Beyond the Blueprint looks specifically at the conversation around ESG in the South African context. So the idea is to demystify ESG for local players. It should not be an expensive exercise to position yourself as ESG compliant in our ecosystem. It should not be an external exercise. And by that, I mean, if you're doing everything that you need to be doing as a business, there's no need to create a new department or hire expensive consultants to, retell your stories. So we're going to be, we've started designing a playbook around ESG for South Africa. So the intention is that alongside every Beyond the Blueprint, we release a playbook so that you can start applying a lot of these lessons in your organization or in your projects yourself. I'm asking everyone in the audience to just give us some time because everything's just kind of in the works right now. But that will be released at some point in time. And then obviously, if you follow Beyond the Blueprint and Katie Strategies on social media, we will be releasing little toolkits and frameworks and things going forward. So our big commitment is that I believe, my reckoning was that a lot of this information, I mean, in South Africa, culturally, we know that a lot of very, very important knowledge is being lost because it's undocumented and it's not shared, right? We talk about the loss of indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom and the anthropological loss of, our future history. We don't want, as an organization and as a team, for all of these lessons that we've learned to be lost in the sort of history of the organization itself. I believe it's too valuable for all of us to be hidden behind intellectual property rights. So we're just going to be releasing everything. If you'd like to have a conversation with us about anything, and please feel free to engage, but that's kind of our stance as an organization now. We want to share.
That is incredibly generous and might seem even a little bit difficult to understand. But really, there is much more at stake here than just getting one project finished. This is a matter of sharing the knowledge that can help every other project succeed. But there is more, and this is in a beautifully documented explanation of what all these insights from Beyond the Blueprint are, and that also can help to give you deeper insight. And I love the fact that Kalnisha's framed it around case studies, three different case studies for every one of the insights. And if you're, whether you're in the energy sector, the infrastructure sector, or somewhere else, you're probably going to look at those case studies and go, I've had that problem. And the solutions are unpacked beautifully there, but more importantly, how you can avoid that problem in the future. You've just heard Kalnisha say, this is for sharing. So there's no copyright on this. It's there for you to share. Please share it with your colleagues, discuss it with your colleagues, and feel free to share it online, even if you want to, with credit to Kalnisha that is built into the document. So spread the word because this is too important to go and simply either just attend this and leave, or also to just attend, go and download it, and it ends up in one of these days I'm going to read it folders. Grab that folder and get a conversation partner, get your team to discuss it because you're going to get incredible value out of this. And of course, we'd love to hear what your experience has been. So you're also welcome to reach out to Kalnisha and her team at the link that you've seen now for the download. You will also be able to contact the KD Strategies team if you'd like to have a chat, or you have any questions, or you'd like to take this further, or even you have insights that may be of value. Go get your Beyond the Blueprint document, use it, share it, and we'd love to see it help you to succeed even more in what you're doing to help build this incredible country.
That's such a great question, and it's unfortunately not an easy answer. So the responsibility lies firmly on the shoulders of of two or three different parties, right? There's a mandated requirement that the developer engages in public participation processes during the development and feasibility study phases. Lolo, I think you know this. But that's the participation process that I was talking about earlier. It's not necessarily designed in a way that is fully and truly inclusive in a South African context. And I'll talk about the Northern Cape specifically. There's a requirement in the public participation process, the mandated public participation process, that community meetings are advertised in the local media, right? An advert in the local newspaper. If you're up in Port Nolloth in the Northern Cape, the closest newspaper is published in Springbok, which is what, 400, 500 kilometers away. It's very unlikely that the local community is going to read that newspaper. So it's a failure, it's a flaw in the regulation that we need to directly address. But it's also a requirement of the public participation process that the private sector entity engages with the local public sector stakeholders. So that usually means the municipal officials, the councillors, and the sort of political structures within the municipality and the municipal administrative structures, right? It is the responsibility of the municipal councillors to inform their constituents, right, of any activity that's happening in their constituency. That's also a point of disconnection that we've seen in our, in our research, in our scoping exercises, that the communication doesn't flow from the municipal structures to the communities. But then I'd also say that the responsibility then is on the community to use their civic rights to hold their municipal structures to account. It's very difficult for a community to hold a private sector entity to account, right? because that's a judicial legal process and it's very expensive. But the community has every right to go camp on the front lawn of the local councillor and say, hey, why did you not tell us?
Mm.
And that activity is still not happening either. So it's unfortunately one of those situations where all parties are responsible. Some are more responsible than others, but like nobody's taking accountability. And it's really something that we need to firstly educate our communities um, on how to engage, on what they're entitled to, the kind of communication they're entitled to. But it's also for the communities, I believe, and there are lots of structures in place now around community-based organizations and creating collaborative networks of community-based organizations that are being facilitated by the GIZ and stuff. And I can send you more information about that, where there's encouragement for community stakeholders to engage with the private sector actors directly around what will work for them and what won't work for them in terms of communication and public participation. But having said all of that, I also think that what is kind of materially misunderstood in all of these dynamics is that, and I think I said it in the session, everybody's priority is fundamentally different, right? The private sector entity, their only priority is to comply with whatever they need to comply with. It's risk mitigation. It's to mitigate their risks of non-compliance. And having said that, they typically engage in a way to so as to manage expectations and mitigate the risk. If they don't need, in inverted commas, to engage directly from a risk mitigation perspective, then they don't. Unfortunately, it's the reality. But that's also why it's really important for community-based organizations to sort of force engagement. And I say force engagement, like initiate the engagement as well. Make themselves known. Because also, I think, these human dynamics are fascinating and in communities, what we found is that, people wait to be spoken to first. And I feel like the time of that is like gone. We need to sort of be more proactive in our engagement.
Kalnisha, again, thank you so very, very much for sharing this and for channeling that frustration. I think that's an example for all of us. Where are our frustrations and what can we do with them so that they really go and benefit people? I really believe that Beyond the Blueprint, this whole series can have a tremendous impact, starting with this very first edition.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was great.